For 30 years, they walked past him every morning. Just the old janitor with his mop and quiet smile, cleaning up after teenagers who barely noticed he existed. Franklin worked in the shadows, fixing what was broken, cleaning what was dirty, never asking for thanks. Then one Tuesday afternoon, a storage box fell from his supply closet. What scattered across the floor changed everything those students thought they knew about the man who'd been watching over them all along. Welcome to the Human Stories. From which city are you watching this video today? Leave it in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us keep these voices alive. Franklin Monroe had been the janitor at Lincoln High School since 1989. Every morning at 6:15 a.m., his battered Ford pickup would pull into the staff parking lot, the engine making the same wheezing sound it had made for the past decade. He would sit for a moment, staring at the brick building that had become his second home, then slowly climb out with the careful movements of a man whose joints remembered harder times. The students knew him simply as Mr. Frank. He was part of the scenery, like the faded motivational posters in the hallways or the perpetually broken water fountain by the gym. He moved through their world with practiced invisibility, arriving before they woke up and staying long after they'd forgotten the school existed. Most days, Franklin preferred it that way. At 74, he had learned the value of quiet routines. Coffee at 6:30 from the teacher's lounge, machine that only he knew how to fix. Unlock the main doors at 7 o'clock sharp. Check the boiler, replace burned-out lights, set up chairs for the morning assembly. By the time the first bus arrived, Lincoln High was ready for another day, and Franklin had already faded into the background. But backgrounds have a way of revealing themselves when you're not expecting it. Tuesday, October 12th, started like any other day. Franklin was in Building C, the oldest part of the school, dealing with a persistent leak in room 237. Mrs. Peterson had been complaining about it for weeks, water dripping steadily onto her desk during American history lessons. The irony wasn't lost on Franklin that water was interrupting lessons about the past. If only Mrs. Peterson knew what history was stored just one floor below her classroom. The leak had gotten worse overnight. What started as an annoying drip had become a steady stream, threatening to flood the supply closet, where Franklin kept his tools and cleaning equipment. He worked methodically, the way he always did, tightening fittings and replacing worn washers. But the old pipes had ideas of their own. When the fitting finally gave way completely, water erupted from the wall with surprising force. Franklin scrambled to shut off the main valve, his boots splashing through rapidly spreading puddles. In the chaos, he didn't notice the cardboard box on the top shelf, beginning to sag under the weight of accumulated moisture. 20 minutes later, with the water finally stopped and towels spread across the floor, Franklin began assessing the damage. Most of his supplies were salvageable. Industrial-strength disinfectant doesn't mind getting wet. But the box on the top shelf had absorbed too much water. As he reached for it, the bottom gave way entirely. The contents scattered across the wet floor with a series of metallic clinks, and in the soft thud of fabric hitting linoleum. Franklin froze, staring down at pieces of his life he hadn't seen in 15 years. A faded olive-green uniform jacket, the fabric still crisped despite its age. A stack of black and white photographs, their edges curled but images still clear. Letters tied with string, the ink slightly faded but still legible. And there, catching the fluorescent light like a fallen star, the unmistakable blue ribbon and bronze medal it constituted America's highest military honor. Franklin stood motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then with shaking hands. He began gathering the scattered pieces of 1944. He didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway. He didn't notice the classroom door had been left open, or that Mrs. Peterson's American history class was on their way back from the library. He was completely absorbed in collecting memories he had spent decades trying to forget. "Mr. Frank, are you okay in there?" The voice belonged to Sarah Martinez, a junior who had always been polite to him, unlike some of her classmates who treated him like furniture. She appeared in the doorway with two other students, Tommy Chon, who played saxophone in the school band, and Marcus Williams, a football player who volunteered at the local Veterans Center. Franklin looked up, still holding the Medal of Honor in his hands. For a moment, none of them moved. The teenagers stared at the scene before them, their quiet janitor, surrounded by what looked like military artifacts, holding something that gleamed with unmistakable importance. Marcus was the first to speak. His volunteer work had taught him to recognize certain things. "Sir, is that?" Franklin followed his gaze to the medal in his hands. There was no point in hiding it now. The box had literally fallen open, spilling secrets he'd kept locked away for 3 decades. "It's nothing," he said quietly. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were unconvincing. You don't casually possess the Medal of Honor. You don't accidentally have photographs of D-Day beaches. You don't quietly store Purple Hearts and bronze stars in school supply closets. Sarah knelt down and picked up one of the photographs that had landed near her feet. It showed a group of young soldiers on what looked like a landing craft, their faces blackened with paint, wearing heavy packs and helmets. They looked impossibly young, impossibly serious. "Mr. Frank," she said softly, "this is you, isn't it?" In the photograph, a 20-year-old Franklin Monroe stared back at them from 75 years in the past. Same eyes, same serious expression, but wrapped in the uniform of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. Franklin slowly stood up, his knees protesting after crouching on the wet floor. He looked at the 3 students, then at the scattered contents of his past, then back at the students. They weren't going to simply walk away and pretend they hadn't seen anything. These were good kids, and they deserved some kind of explanation. "That was a long time ago," he said finally. Tommy picked up another photograph, this one showing soldiers wading through surf toward a beach studded with obstacles. "This is Omaha Beach," he said with certainty. "We studied this in Mrs. Peterson's class last month." Franklin nodded slowly. "June 6, 1944, D-Day. You were there?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Another nod. "First wave. 630 hours." The students exchanged glances. They were holding pieces of history, not the sanitized version from textbooks, but the real thing. Photos taken by someone who had lived through the most important day of the 20th century. "Sir," Sarah said carefully, "what did you do to earn this?" She gestured toward the Medal of Honor, still in Franklin's hands. Franklin was quiet for so long that the students began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 7 decades. "I tried to get my boys home." That simple sentence hung in the air between them. It was both a complete explanation and no explanation at all. Mrs. Peterson chose that moment to appear in the doorway, wondering why half her class was missing from their assigned seats. "What's going on here?" she asked, then stopped as she took in the scene. Her eyes moved from the scattered military artifacts to the medal in Franklin's hands, to the odd expressions on her students' faces. Mrs. Peterson had been teaching American history for 22 years. She had covered D-Day countless times, shown documentaries, assigned research papers, invited guest speakers, but she had never expected to find a piece of living, history mopping the floors of her own school. "Mr. Monroe," she said quietly, using his last name for the first time in the 5 years. They'd worked in the same building. "Would you mind if I asked these students to give us some privacy?" Franklin looked at the teenagers who had stumbled into his past. Part of him wanted to send them away, to stuff everything back into a box and pretend this moment had never happened. But another part of him, a part that had been silent for 3 decades, recognized something in their faces. Respect, wonder, the same expression he'd seen on young faces in 1944, when ordinary people found themselves part of something extraordinary. "Actually," Franklin said slowly, "if you don't mind, Mrs. Peterson, I think they've earned the right to hear this." The teacher nodded and stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Franklin carefully placed the Medal of Honor on a desk where everyone could see it, then began to speak in a voice that grew stronger with each word. "The morning of June 6, 1944, was the longest morning of my life. We'd been on those landing crafts for hours, and every man knew what was waiting for us on that beach. The Germans had been preparing for months. Mines, barbed wire, machine gun nests, artillery positions. They'd turned Normandy into a killing field." He picked up the photograph of the landing craft. "I was a sergeant with the 16th Infantry Regiment, 20 years old and scared out of my mind, but trying not to show it because my boys were looking to me for confidence I didn't have." Sarah studied his face, trying to reconcile the elderly janitor. They knew with the young soldier in the photograph. "How many men were in your unit?" "I had 12 men under my command. Kids, really. The oldest was maybe 22. Farm boys from Iowa, city kids from New York. A mechanic from Detroit who could fix anything with an engine. Good men, every one of them." Franklin moved to another photograph, this one showing soldiers pinned down on a beach, their gear scattered around crater holes in the sand. "This was taken about an hour after we landed. We'd made it off the beach, but barely. Half my squad was hit in the first 10 minutes. Marcus leaned forward. "What happened to them?" "That's where this comes in," Franklin said, touching the medal gently. "Private Johnson, kid from Nebraska, took shrapnel in his leg. Couldn't move. Private Garcia got hit in the shoulder. Same explosion. 2 more boys were pinned down behind a sea wall with a German machine gun nest keeping them from advancing or retreating." He paused, his eyes distant. "I had a choice. Leave them behind and advance with the main force, or go back and try to get them out." Mrs. Peterson spoke quietly. "What did you do?" "I went back 3 times. First for Johnson and Garcia, then for the other 2 boys. The machine gun nest was maybe 50 yards from where they were trapped. Every time I moved, those Germans opened up with everything they had." Tommy was staring at the Medal of Honor with new understanding. "You crossed that open ground 3 times? 4 times, actually. Had to go back for their equipment, radio, medical supplies, ammunition. Couldn't leave that for the Germans to use against other American units coming up the beach." Sarah shook her head. "How did you survive that?" Franklin smiled for the first time since the box had fallen. "I was fast, and lucky, and probably too scared to think straight. When you see your boys bleeding in the sand, you don't think about the odds. You just think about getting them home to their mothers." He picked up another photograph, this one showing a group of soldiers in what looked like a field hospital. All 4 of them made it. Johnson lost his leg below the knee, but he made it home. Garcia recovered completely, went on to become a teacher in California. The other 2 boys served through the rest of the war. Marcus had been quiet, but now he spoke up. "Sir, why didn't you ever tell anyone about this?" Franklin looked at him with tired eyes. "Tell them what? That I did what any decent man would do? That I tried to take care of my boys? That's not heroism, son. That's just not abandoning the people counting on you." Mrs. Peterson had tears in her eyes. "Mr. Monroe, you saved 4 lives under enemy fire. You risked your own life repeatedly to rescue wounded soldiers. That's the definition of heroism." "Maybe," Franklin said quietly, "but I also lived when better men didn't. I came home when kids with wives and babies didn't make it off that beach. Hard to feel heroic about that." The room fell silent. These students had grown up in a world where social media turned every minor achievement into cause for celebration, where participation trophies were common and real sacrifice was abstract. They were trying to process a man who had performed genuine heroics and then spent 70 years quietly mopping floors. Sarah finally broke the silence. "Mr. Frank, how long have you worked here?" 30 years next month. "And you never told anyone?" Franklin shrugged. "Didn't seem relevant. You kids need someone to keep the building clean and fix broken things. My job isn't to tell war stories. It's to make sure you have a safe place to learn." Tommy held up one of the letters tied with string. "Can I ask what these are?" Franklin's expression softened. "Letters from the families. Johnson's mother wrote to me every Christmas for 20 years. Garcia sent pictures of his kids, thanked me for giving him the chance to have them. Those mean more to me than any medal." He gathered the scattered photographs, handling each one like a fragile treasure. "This is Private Kelly, died 2 days after D-Day, stepped on a mine. This is Corporal Santos, made it all the way to Germany before a sniper got him in Berlin. Good men, all of them." Marcus stood up abruptly. "Ma'am, can I get the rest of the class? They need to hear this." Mrs. Peterson looked at Franklin, who nodded slowly. "I suppose it's time." 20 minutes later, the entire American history class was crowded into the supply closet and hallway, sitting on the floor, leaning against walls, completely silent as Franklin Monroe told them about the longest day of his life. He spoke about fear and courage, about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, about the price of freedom and the weight of survival. When he finished, no one moved for a long moment. Then Sarah stood up and did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She saluted. One by one, the other students followed suit. Even those who didn't know proper military protocol stood at attention, showing respect the only way they knew how. Franklin looked at them, these teenagers who had accidentally stumbled into his past, and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Pride, not in his own actions, but in theirs, in their willingness to listen, to understand, to honor something bigger than themselves. "Mr. Monroe," Mrs. Peterson said finally, "would you consider speaking to our other classes? The freshmen are studying World War II next month." Franklin considered this. For 75 years, he had kept these stories locked away, believing they belonged to the past. But looking at the faces around him, he realized that maybe the past wasn't meant to stay buried. Maybe some stories needed to be told, not for glory, but for memory. "I suppose I could do that," he said quietly, "but only if you understand. I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who tried to do right by the people counting on him." Marcus shook his head. "Sir, with respect, that's exactly what a hero is." Over the following weeks, word spread through Lincoln High in the way that important news always does, quietly, reverently, person to person. The custodian wasn't just Mr. Frank anymore. He was Sergeant Franklin Monroe, Medal of Honor recipient, D-Day veteran, the man who had literally helped win World War II, and then spent 3 decades emptying their trash without ever mentioning it. Students started greeting him differently in the hallways, not with pity or awkward reverence, but with genuine respect. They began staying after class to help move furniture, to assist with repairs, to simply say thank you for keeping their school running. Franklin found himself invited to speak to history classes, not as a guest lecturer, but as a primary source. He would sit in a circle with students, showing photographs and answering questions about a world they could barely imagine. What was it like? They would ask. Were you scared? Did you think about dying? How did you find the courage? And Franklin would answer honestly, without glorifying war or minimizing its costs. He spoke about fear and duty, about the bonds between soldiers, about coming home to a world that had moved on without them. But perhaps the most important lesson came not from his war stories, but from his example. Here was a man who had performed genuine heroics and then returned to a quiet life of service. He didn't need parades or recognition. He didn't demand special treatment. He simply did his job, day after day, year after year, finding dignity in honest work and purpose in helping others. The students began to understand that heroism wasn't a single moment of courage, though Franklin had certainly had those. True heroism was choosing to do the right thing consistently, whether anyone was watching or not. It was taking care of people who depended on you, whether they were wounded soldiers on a beach in Normandy or teenagers who needed a safe, clean place to learn. On Veterans Day that year, Lincoln High held its first ever assembly honoring Franklin Monroe. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, parents, and local veterans who had heard about the Medal of Honor recipient working quietly among them. Franklin sat on the stage in his best clothes, the same suit he'd worn to funerals and graduations for 30 years, looking uncomfortable with the attention but grateful for the respect. When asked to speak, he stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. "I want to thank you all for this," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "But I need you to understand something. The real heroes of D-Day are the ones who didn't come home. The boys who gave everything so that we could have days like today, in places like this, with freedom to learn and grow and dream." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've spent 30 years in this building, watching thousands of young people walk these halls. Every one of you has the potential to be a hero, not necessarily on a battlefield, but in your communities, in your families, in the quiet moments when you have to choose between what's easy and what's right." The applause was long and heartfelt, but Franklin raised his hand for quiet. He had one more thing to say. "The medal they gave me represents 4 men who made it home because someone cared enough to go back for them. Every day in this school, I see people going back for each other. Teachers staying late to help struggling students. Students helping classmates who are having a hard time. Staff members, yes, even us custodians, trying to create a place where everyone can succeed." He smiled at the audience. "That's heroism too. That's how you honor the sacrifice of those who came before, by taking care of the people around you." The assembly ended with the entire school standing for the national anthem. But this time it felt different. The words carried weight that many of them were truly hearing for the first time. Land of the free, home of the brave concepts that had been abstract before were now embodied by the quiet man who had been among them all along. Franklin Monroe continued working at Lincoln High for 3 more years before finally retiring at age 77. On his last day, the entire school gathered in the parking lot to see him off. His battered Ford pickup was decorated with ribbons and signs, and students lined the driveway to applaud as he drove away. But his real legacy wasn't in the ceremony or the recognition. It was in the understanding he had given them about service, sacrifice, and the quiet heroism of daily life. Students who might have taken their freedom for granted now understood its cost. Young people who had never considered military service began to think about ways they could serve their country and communities. Most importantly, they learned that heroes don't always look heroic. Sometimes they look like janitors with mops and toolboxes, working in the background to keep the world running smoothly. Sometimes they're the people you walk past every day without really seeing, carrying stories of courage and sacrifice that would humble you if you took the time to listen. Years later, when those students became adults with children of their own, they would tell the story of Franklin Monroe. They would teach their kids to look for the heroes hiding in plain sight, to respect the people who serve without recognition, and to understand that the most powerful stories don't always make headlines. The Medal of Honor now sits in a place of honor in Lincoln High's trophy case, on permanent loan from Franklin's family. Next to it is a simple plaque that reads, "In memory of Sergeant Franklin, Monroe and all those who serve quietly among us." But perhaps the greatest monument, too, Franklin's legacy is something less tangible. The way his students learned to see heroism, not as something distant and dramatic, but as something close and daily. The understanding that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right despite that fear. And sometimes, late at night, when the school is empty and quiet, visitors say they can still hear the soft sound of footsteps in the hallways, the ghost of a hero making his rounds, checking that everything is secure, that all is well, that the next generation is safe to learn and dream and grow. Franklin Monroe never wanted to be remembered as a hero. He just wanted to do his job, take care of his people, and earn his way in the world through honest work. But in trying to be invisible, he became unforgettable. In trying to be ordinary, he taught extraordinary lessons about service, sacrifice, and the quiet dignity of doing what's right. That's the thing about real heroes. They don't seek recognition. They don't demand applause. They just show up, do the work, and trust that their example speaks louder than any words they could say. And sometimes, when you're not expecting it, a box falls from a storage shelf, and you discover that the person you've been walking past every day is the answer to prayers you didn't even know had been whispered on a beach in Normandy 75 years ago.